past few years, Manchester has been blighted by weapons and by gangs.
The investigation would lead to a remarkable trial. The most severe sentences in Manchester gangland history. And a unique and controversial publicity campaign.
This is the story of how Greater Manchester Police brought down the Gooch Gang.
There was a time when the city of Manchester, a vibrant hub of music, sport, and industry, was known by another, more sinister name, Gunchester. It was a title whispered in fear and splashed across headlines, a name born from a brutal and relentless gang war that held an entire city in its grip. This wasn't a distant problem confined to forgotten alleyways, it was a conflict that spilled into the open, with gunfire becoming an almost routine sound in some neighborhoods. At the very heart of this storm were two of Britain's most notorious criminal organizations, locked in a feud for power, territory, and revenge. This is the story of the rise, the bloody reign, and the epic fall of the most dominant of those gangs, the Gooch Gang. The rise of Gunchester. Our story begins not with a gunshot, but in the quiet decay of the late 1980s, in the South Manchester district of Moss Side. This was a community feeling profoundly left behind. The collapse of local industry had ripped the economic heart out of the area, leaving a vacuum of opportunity. By the early 1990s, unemployment in Moss Side had soared to nearly 30%, almost 3 times the national average. The 1981 riots had left deep scars, both physical and social, and a sense of alienation festered, particularly among the youth who saw few legitimate paths to success. In this environment of social neglect, a new and illicit power structure began to form. On the west side of the sprawling Alexandra Park estate, a group of young men started to gather in a small, unassuming cul-de-sac called Gooch Close. It's from this street that they would take their name. Initially, their activities were small-scale, selling drugs, controlling their immediate turf, and making money in an underground economy that was booming while the official one was bust. This was the genesis of the Gooch Close Gang, or as they'd soon be known across the city, simply the Gooch. Their business model was ruthlessly simple. They supplied the street-level dealers with narcotics and, in return, offered them protection. This protection wasn't a service, it was a demand. It meant shielding their dealers from rivals, but it also meant enforcing their own rigid hierarchy. In this world, respect was the ultimate currency, a reputation earned through intimidation and defended with explosive violence. As the gang's influence swelled, so did their territory. Their control bled out from Moss Side into the nearby neighborhoods of Hume, Fallowfield, and Old Trafford. But they were not unopposed. Power abhors a vacuum, and on the other side of the very same estate, another crew was taking shape. Originally known as the Pepper Hill Mob, they would regroup and rename themselves after Doddington Close. They became the Doddington Gang. Born from the exact same social and economic pressures, they were a mirror image of the Gooch. Their rivalry, which began over the lucrative drug trade, would soon define an era, turning the streets of South Manchester into a war zone and staining them with blood for 2 decades. The rivalry and the roots of war. For a time, a tense and fragile truce held between the Gooch and Doddington gangs. There were even attempts by older gang figures to broker peace, arranging symbolic football matches to ease hostilities. But in the volatile and high-stakes world of organized crime, peace is seldom a lasting state. The feud that would cement Manchester's Gunchester moniker ignited in the early 1990s, escalating from turf disputes into a deeply personal and deadly war. The violence was shocking in its frequency. By 1992, gunfire was an almost daily occurrence, with some reports claiming 2 shooting incidents a day in Moss Side alone. The war turned the Alexandra Park estate into a place of fear, forcing innocent families to flee their homes as the gangs destroyed vacant properties to use for storing drugs and weapons. The violence was not only frequent but also appallingly indiscriminate. In January 1993, the city was rocked by the murder of 14-year-old Benji Stanley. He was not a gang member, he was a boy, standing in line at Alvino's Takeaway, a local Caribbean food shop on Great Western Street. Gunmen shot him through the door, then stood over his body and fired again. Benji was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, a piece of collateral damage in a war he had no part in. His death became a tragic national symbol of the chaos engulfing the city, a grim underscore of how ordinary people were being caught in the crossfire. No one has ever been prosecuted for his murder. The sheer lawlessness of the era was broadcast to the entire nation that same year. The then leader of the Liberal Democrats, Paddy Ashton, was visiting Moss Side to witness the urban decay firsthand. During a press tour of a local shopping precinct, he was allegedly confronted by a 15-year-old boy. The teenager pulled back his jacket to reveal the butt of a submachine gun and told the political leader to get out. The incident sent shockwaves through a country unaccustomed to such brazen displays of armed criminality. Yet, on the streets of South Manchester, it was just another day. The gangs ruled through a pervasive culture of fear. Time and again, major trials would collapse as witnesses were intimidated into silence, terrified of the brutal consequences of speaking out. For a long, dark period, it seemed the gangs were untouchable. The generals take command. By the early 2000s, the Gooch Gang's leadership structure had solidified. At the top were Colin Joyce, who called himself the General, and his trusted right-hand man, Lee Amos, known on the street as Icabo. Joyce was the strategist, the ambitious and ruthless leader, while Amos was described by police as the best weapon, cool, calm, and collected. Together, they transformed the Gooch from a territorial street crew into a sophisticated and hierarchical criminal machine. Below them, a network of senior members and foot soldiers, some still teenagers, enforced their dominion, dealing drugs and carrying out acts of extreme violence. Their ascent, however, was not without interruption. In 2000, Joyce and Amos were arrested in a house in Moss Side that police would later describe as the gang's nerve center. The raid uncovered what officers called an extraordinary array of firearms, a clear indication of the gang's level of organization and violent intent. For this, the two leaders were convicted and handed 9-year prison sentences in 2001, a move that should have neutralized their influence for the better part of a decade. It didn't. In a decision that would have catastrophic consequences, both men were released early on license in 2007. Their return to the streets of Manchester was like throwing a lit match into a puddle of gasoline. Prison had not reformed them, it had hardened them. They emerged bolder, more determined, and, according to police, utterly consumed by a thirst for revenge. A key motivation was the murder of Lee Amos's younger brother, 21-year-old Stephen, who was shot and killed in a 2002 drive-by attack by the rival Longside crew. While inside, Joyce and Amos had been plotting. Their release wasn't merely a return to business, it was the beginning of the final, and by far the most violent, chapter in the history of the Gunchester Wars. The murders that sealed their fate. The year 2007 marked a terrifying escalation. Back on the streets, Joyce and Amos embarked on a mission to reassert their dominance and settle old scores with chilling brutality. On June 15, they made their first major move. Eventual, a 23-year-old with associations to the rival Longside crew, was driving his car in South Manchester when he was ambushed. In a brazen daylight attack, a car driven by Colin Joyce pulled up alongside him. A gunman in the back peppered Chin's car with bullets from a converted Russian Baikal pistol, a self-loading handgun that had become a signature weapon of the Gooch Gang. Chin was hit 3 times and died at the scene. The sheer audacity of the public execution sent a clear and terrifying message across the city's criminal underworld. But it was what happened next that demonstrated a new level of cold-blooded depravity. 6 weeks later, on the night of July 27th, friends and family of Eventual gathered for a makeshift wake at a house in Frobisher Close, Longside. Just before midnight, a crowd of around 80 mourners stood in the street, paying their respects. Suddenly, a convoy of 3 cars rolled past. Gunmen opened fire on the crowd, spraying bullets indiscriminately into the group of grieving people. Caught in the hail of bullets was 23-year-old Tyrone Gilbert, a friend of Chin's and a father of 3. A single bullet struck him in the chest, and he died at the scene. For the Greater Manchester Police, this was the final straw. Attacking a funeral wake was an act of ultimate disrespect, a calculated display designed to inflict maximum fear and psychological trauma. The murders of Eventual and Tyrone Gilbert were not just gangland killings, they were public executions, meticulously planned to showcase the Gooch Gang's absolute power and ruthlessness. But in their hubris, Colin Joyce and Lee Amos had fatally overplayed their hand. They believed they were above the law, but in committing such heinous acts, They had left a trail of evidence and, more importantly, triggered a police response on a scale Manchester had never seen before. The investigation, Operation Silverstone. In the aftermath of the two murders, the Greater Manchester Police launched Operation Silverstone, one of the most complex, expensive, and far-reaching investigations in the force's history. The city's specialists' caliber task force had been chipping away at the gangs for years, but this operation was different. The objective wasn't just to disrupt the Gooch Gang, it was to systematically dismantle their entire criminal enterprise, from the leadership down to the street dealers. It was a monumental undertaking. Initially, detectives were confronted by the familiar wall of silence, a barrier built on years of witness intimidation and a deep-seated fear of reprisal. To break through it, investigators had to build a case so meticulously detailed and technologically airtight that it would be impossible to refute in court. They painstakingly pieced together a jigsaw of over 80,000 mobile phone calls and text messages, using cell site data to track the locations and communications of gang members on the days of the murders. Advanced ballistics work linked the shell casings recovered from both murder scenes to the same cache of weapons. Surveillance teams worked around the clock, and countless hours of CCTV footage were analyzed to trace the gang's movements. The decisive breakthrough, however, came from within the gang itself. In an unprecedented move, police managed to persuade 6 former Gooch associates to break the code of silence and testify against their one-time bosses. Their identities were strictly protected, and their evidence was given anonymously in court. These insiders provided the final, crucial pieces of the puzzle, drawing a direct line from Colin Joyce and Lee Amos to the planning and execution of the murders. Their testimony exposed the inner workings of a massive conspiracy of drugs, guns, and violence. As the lead detective put it, scratching the surface of 2 murders had uncovered a criminal empire that had been operating for years. With the evidence secured, the net began to close. Between August 2007 and May 2008, police swooped in, arresting 11 key members of the gang, including the 2 men at the very top. The Fall, Britain's biggest gang trial. In April 2009, the trial of 11 members of the Gooch Gang began. In a highly unusual measure designed to prevent the witness intimidation that had plagued previous Manchester gang trials, the proceedings were moved 35 miles away to the heavily secured Liverpool Crown Court. This became one of the biggest and most expensive trials of its kind in British legal history, lasting a full 6 months and costing over £5 million. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution meticulously laid out the full scope of the Gooch Gang's criminal enterprise. They detailed not just the murders of Eventual and Tyrone Gilbert, but a horrifying catalogue of other crimes, the systematic torture of drug dealers who fell out of line, the trafficking of heroin and cocaine, and the rampant possession of illegal firearms. The court heard how the gang would take guns into nightclubs and even lure children into their ranks to act as dealers. Colin Joyce, defiant and arrogant to the end, dismissed the entire process as a circus. But the weight of the evidence, from mobile phone data, ballistics, and the crucial testimony of former insiders, was simply overwhelming. The jury returned guilty verdicts on 26 of the 27 charges. Colin Joyce was found guilty of murdering both Eventual and Tyrone Gilbert. Lee Amos was convicted for his role in the murder of Tyrone Gilbert. Both were also found guilty of a slew of other charges, including attempted murder and firearms possession. The judge, Mr. Justice Langstaff, did not hold back in his sentencing. He compared their reign of terror to that of Al Capone in Prohibition-era Chicago, telling them, "Manchester is not the Wild West, but many of you treated its streets as if it were." Colin Joyce, the general, was given a minimum sentence of 39 years in prison. His right-hand man, Lee Amos, received a minimum of 35 years. 9 other gang members were also convicted and handed sentences ranging from 5 years to life, effectively dismantling the gang's entire command structure in one fell swoop. An era of terror was finally over. The legacy of Gunchester. The convictions were a seismic turning point for Manchester. In the year following the trial, Greater Manchester Police reported that gang-related shootings had plummeted by a staggering 92%. The name Gunchester, once a grim media staple, began to fade into history. To hammer the message home that no one was untouchable, police launched a controversial but highly effective advertising campaign. A giant billboard was erected on Princess Parkway, a major artery into the city, featuring artificially aged photos of the jailed gang leaders. The caption was blunt, "Aging behind bars." The story of the Gooch Gang is a dark and violent chapter in Manchester's modern history. It serves as a powerful reminder of how poverty, social exclusion, and neglect can create a fertile breeding ground for organized crime. But it is also a story of a city's profound resilience. Throughout the worst of the violence, community groups like Mothers Against Violence marched in protest, and the vast majority of citizens refused to let their city be defined by the actions of a violent few. Lead Cabo Slamos would never see freedom again. He died in prison from a heart attack in April 2024 at the age of 48. The criminal empire he and Colin Joyce built is now gone, systematically dismantled by a landmark police investigation and the bravery of those who dared to speak out. The streets they once ruled with fear have been reclaimed, and the name Gunchester is now, for the most part, just a relic of a past that Manchester has fought incredibly hard to leave behind. Let us know in the comments what case you think we should cover next.